loves, welcome back to another episode in my estrangement series. This week I want to talk to you about books, some of the books that I have been reading that have really helped me come to terms with parental estrangement and toxic parent experiences, especially around narcissistic mothers and narcissistic fathers. So let's jump into it. Okay, I'm gonna start with my absolute favorite first, which is this one here. I read it on my Kindle. If you don't have a Kindle, by the way, as a side note, 10 out of 10 recommend. I'm a big reader. I set myself a target this year to read 75 books, and I'm not doing too badly. I'm nearly up to 50. I think I might fall a little bit short, but I'm really proud of how much reading I've done, because reading is like my relaxation. I love it. And I've been trying to do that, and my Kindle has been huge in that, because I can take it away with me. I can have like 5-6 books on a holiday or something like that, or if I'm knowing that I'm going to go somewhere and be stuck on a train or something for a couple of hours and I've not got any work that I need to do there and then, I can chill out, I can read, and it's all there. And just before I do start talking about this book, one of the tips that I recommend to anybody who is going on a healing journey and reading about estrangement, trying to understand their own estrangement or perhaps their partner's estrangement and be there to support, it can be really heavy, like really heavy reading. And what I tend to do, and I never used to do this before because I found it so baffling, but I find it really useful to have one book that's like serious, educational, personal development, something along those lines, whether I'm reading about feminism, estrangement, sexuality, whatever I'm actually reading about that is a more serious topic that takes quite a bit of thought, takes quite a bit of oomph in it. I have that book, and then I have a book that's solely for enjoyment, solely for me to unwind with. It might be a fantasy book, it might be a detective series book, whatever it is, something that I can switch off with and I can just read for pleasure and for enjoyment. So I have that book, and then I read alongside that my book about estrangement, and I found that really helpful because sometimes it was just so overwhelming. This book in particular by Danu Morrigan, called You're Not Crazy, It's Your Mother, that was one of the heaviest books that I found to read, because it was like she had placed a camera in my childhood throughout the whole thing. Even scenarios that she was using to describe were so accurate to my childhood. It was scary at points, and it was really overwhelming to look at my mum. It's all about narcissistic mothers and how they raise their children, and it was really overwhelming to actually have to sit with the fact that my mum had these traits and qualities. And Danu is not a psychologist. She's writing it from a peer point of view, which I found really helpful. She's not writing it as a psychology paper or anything like that, which I loved. She's written it from the perspective of a daughter of a narcissistic mother, and I think what I going off there. I think what I really appreciated about that was that I could relate to it. And she says she's not a therapist, she's not a psychologist, she is not diagnosing her mother, but you don't need to be a zoologist to see that that's a tiger. She doesn't need to be a therapist to see that her mother has all these narcissistic traits. So while she will never get a diagnosis for her mother, because her mother simply wouldn't go to therapy, it was not her mother's fault, obviously, she could tell that these were the traits. And the more she looked into narcissism and researched it, even though it's a very overused term, these traits fit her mother perfectly. So I found that really relatable. It is very much for daughters of narcissistic mothers. There is a mention of sons of narcissistic mothers in there, but I think it's specifically written for daughters. So if you are a son, it might not be as helpful for you, but it's definitely worth a read if you want to learn more about narcissism and specifically how narcissistic mothers act. Secondly, I actually had a hard copy of this. I had to order it off Amazon. This is Shadow Daughter, a memoir of estrangement by Harriet Brown. It's the most recent one that I've read, and I'll be honest with you, I found it really hard going. It feels very much less memoir and more investigation. I think that you can tell a mile away when a book is written by a journalist, and I don't know if you feel the same, but I've read quite a few books now that have been written by journalists, and whilst I've loved them, it's not a criticism, it's just a very different style of writing that I feel is much more investigative and sort of inquires into it. And one of the things that I did find a bit frustrating about Shadow Daughter was that she spoke to parents whose adult children had cut them off. and sort of empathized with them. And I didn't really want that in a book that I was reading. There's so much out there for parents whose children have cut them off that it felt almost frustrating that that was invading a space that was supposed to be for the child of estrangement. Whilst I can absolutely have compassion for those people, and she did acknowledge that quite often in these cases you can read what they're saying and you can hear the same patterns over and over again. I've not done anything, I don't know, I've done all this for them, they owe me this. All the things that you quite often hear when people will say to you, but you only get one mum, and all that stuff. It felt almost a bit like she was sympathising with them, and I didn't want to hear their stories. I wanted to hear stories of people who are in my position, which is why I bought the book. So I found that a little bit frustrating. But there was so much information about estrangement, both from psychologists who were against and for, and from hundreds of adult children that she'd interviewed and spoken to who had chosen to become estranged for a whole range of reasons. Some of them quite difficult to read, but I just felt like it was much more of an investigation. Very interesting if you want to become more educated about estrangement. Possibly less so if you want to understand the feelings of estrangement and if you want to understand your own experiences. Yeah. Okay, next up, this one, But It's Your Family by Dr. Sherry Campbell. I follow Dr. Sherry on Instagram. I'm going to put her handle here. She's really, really insightful. She specialises in toxic family and in estrangement. And this book was written specifically for people who have become estranged. She is a psychotherapist, I want to say. I will correct myself here if I've got that wrong. But she is a psychotherapist, I believe. And she has written numerous books about a toxic family experience, and then this book specifically. She is estranged from family as well as being a specialist in that field. I found it really interesting. I know when I set out I wanted peer written books, not necessarily books written by therapists or by psychologists, but it was really interesting to read about the different kinds of toxic family dynamics. It wasn't specifically focused on narcissism, which I think is quite useful, because although I firmly believe that my mum was a narcissist or is a narcissist, and I firmly believe that that is the kind of family dynamic that I had growing up, I know it's not going to be the same for everybody who becomes estranged. And I think quite often books that are written specifically about one particular personality disorder might not fit everyone, but there are so many reasons why people become estranged. And this was very much in the vein of explaining what's going on in that toxic family dynamic and reassuring the person why that's okay to become estranged and to become no contact, and how that works for people. I thought that was really useful. The only sort of criticism I had of it is I'm definitely not a religious person, and Sherry obviously is, so there was quite a bit at the end of the book that was discussing her faith and how that carried her through. But if you are a religious person who has become estranged, I know that adds an additional layer, and she talked quite openly about how you can navigate your faith that teaches you to respect thy parents and all that kind of thing, and how you can navigate that whilst also being estranged, and why estranging from your parents does not mean that you are breaking your faith. And I thought that would be really, really useful for somebody who was religious, but it wasn't for me, and that kind of detracted a bit from me, because I found myself thinking, oh, I don't believe in your God, so I don't necessarily find it reassuring or comforting to think, but I'm God's child. That's not, yeah, you get me. Next up is this one, Adult Children of Narcissistic and Emotionally Immature Parents by Aphrodite Rossini. Now, there are two books that have pretty much identical titles. So this is the one that I have read. It's a two-part book. It's two in one. Probably my least favourite out of all of them that I've read, although it was very interesting and insightful. I've been told that the other book by the same title is better, and I've been told that that is much more useful, much more insightful. It doesn't deal with estrangement. It deals with, and this is what I mean about there being no books out there that deal with estrangement, which is really frustrating. It doesn't deal with that. It deals with toxic family and toxic relationships with parents. and either becoming no contact or how to navigate those relationships while maintaining contact, which I think could be really useful for people if you're wanting to understand a toxic family dynamic more. But I'm already at the point where I'm estranged, and whilst I do want to understand that, I don't necessarily find that as helpful as something that specifically talks about estrangement and the aftermath. So yeah, it was a mixed bag with this one. I found it quite hard going in places. It was quite dry, but it was insightful. It did give me some understanding, and it didn't focus on mothers either, which obviously I am now coming to terms with my mum and my estrangement from my mum. My dad is already dead, and I had a very toxic relationship with him, so it was interesting to read some of the things about narcissistic fathers and how they operate. I'm not sure if that fits my father or if my father was just absent and neglectful. I'm not sure which one that fits, and again, that's something for me to do my own personal work on. But it was good to see something that was written about both parents as opposed to just mother. And the same could be said for Dr. Sherry's But It's Your Family. Would I recommend this one? I want to buy the other one and read that one first. I actually bought this off the recommendation of someone suggesting it, and they were suggesting the other book. So I think I'm going to read the other book and let you know whether or not I would recommend it. Last but definitely not least is the one that everybody is raving about at the minute, and again, I got a hard copy of this, Jeanette McCurdy. I've been told that listening to this on audiobook is even more powerful, but everybody recommended this to me and was like, oh, it's amazing, you know, as somebody who's estranged, it's great. She's not estranged from her mum. Her mum was a narcissist, which again, it's great if you are wanting to learn about narcissism and you want something that you can relate to. It's also great if you've got an interest in child stars and the psychology behind that. But she's never become estranged from her mum. Her mum died before she became estranged. She was briefly estranged from her grandma, but she doesn't really talk about it. Was it a good book? Yes. It was so insightful. I read it in a couple of days. It was brilliant. Was it about estrangement or particularly relatable for me? No, not necessarily, because a lot of what she talks about in it is about the trauma of being a childhood star and having these expectations from a parent, whereas I didn't feel that that was necessarily relevant for me. I think if you have a narcissistic parent, there are certainly elements of it that you will pick up on, and I recommend to everybody that this is a book to pick up because it is fantastically written, especially if you have an eating disorder. I will actually put at the beginning of this video that there's a trigger warning for these topics, but I think if you've experienced eating disorder or you've had a toxic family member encourage an eating disorder, then it's really going to resonate with you. But it didn't necessarily check the boxes that I perhaps hoped it would, but it checked other boxes, and I recommend it as a read. And that's it. That is where I'm up to. If you have any other suggestions for books, please do put them in the comments. And again, check the comments, because hopefully as a community we can find different things that will help each other. Hopefully as a community we can find books that we can all relate to and that can be useful for helping everyone on their healing journey. Don't forget to check back next week. I will be doing another episode about estrangement and all things relating to that and toxic family. And if you are in the position where you are estranged, then I wholeheartedly want you to know that you are not alone, you are not in the wrong, and you have nothing to be ashamed of.